Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Linda, and I'm originally from Michigan, now living in the St. Louis metro area. I'm a college coach with School Match for You and have a daughter at University of Chicago.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. Good morning, friends. A lot has happened since I last met with you on Thursday. You meaning all listeners and our listening family. Our listening family are those listeners who never miss an episode. There's a special bond I feel we have with you. That's why I call you family. So I've been to Tennessee, and I'm still in Tennessee. I was one of 45 counselors from all over the country, most in the Southeast, but we had like 3 from California, Texas, Midwest, New England, who toured 10 Tennessee colleges and universities. And boy, I tell you, it was a whirlwind. There were days we left at 6:15 and would check into our hotel, or in some case, dorm rooms, 2 nights in hotels, 2 nights in dorm rooms, past 10 o'clock. But the interaction, the fellowship, the learning opportunities to interact with my colleagues was quite rich. About half of the counselors were school-based counselors, and about half were independent educational counselors. And some schools I'll be doing spotlights on. In some cases, you'll hear interviews. I did ask 2 people who really impressed me a lot, both with their communication skills, their knowledge of their schools, and I think they're at schools that would be of interest to a lot of our listeners, to come on and do a college spotlight. So those schools are the University of Tennessee, Knox, or UTK. So you'll be hearing from the VP of Enrollment there. And also Belmont University, you'll be hearing from the VP of Enrollment there. I really liked how they communicated, what they had to say. And so we've already secured those commitments. And it's just a matter about getting them on the calendar. So for today, I'm calling it audible, which you know I'm prone to do. I got a question last night in a counseling session that I think is really important. So I want to answer it. So first, you'll be hearing that. And then secondly, we're going to get into the weeds. So there's some really important information shared in a session at Vanderbilt. We started our tour at Vanderbilt. That was pretty much everything on the 5th was all Vandy. And we ended up at Vandy in the evening of the 9th. So there's a lot of Vandy. And they shared some really important information on the subject of yield. And for those of you who don't know what yield is, listen, you will know for sure, probably the most conversation you've ever heard about yield before you're going to hear from me. And I want to share with you a lot of information about yield and have a real deep dive on that topic. And then we have a whole brand new interview for you that Lisa's done with Elliot Felix. And so, we made a commitment around 9 months ago to not just focus on college admissions, but to focus on success in college. And Lisa's been doing an extraordinary job of interviewing a number of people, authors and leaders, to help us know how our students can be successful once they actually get to college. And this will be a 2-part interview that's got some really, really good content that I can't wait to describe. But for now, let's start by diving into the question. So I'm in the counseling room last night. And by the way, I'm coming to you from a resort. I figured after 15 and a half hour days, I didn't know if I wanted to drive from Nashville back to Atlanta and maybe hit traffic. So we have a timeshare a couple hours from the house. I said I'll stay there for a few days and record this from here and do some Zoom meetings, get a little R&R, and then I might head back tonight or early in the morning back to the ATL. So I'm in a counseling session last night with a man named Chris from the Midwest. I'm just going to keep it vague. And he asked me a question, and he says, how is the ruling on affirmative action going to change admissions? So I wanted to address that for a few reasons. Right now, all the buzz in college admissions on a daily basis is, when is the Supreme Court's ruling coming out on affirmative action? It's expected any day now. It's definitely expected in June, and it could be, could pop tomorrow for all we know. So I'm going to go on record, make some predictions so we can see if I'm right. I definitely am expecting the Supreme Court to curtail the use of race in college admissions. I don't know for sure, nobody does, how exhaustive that change will be. So some of the things that admission officers are asking themselves as they consult with their general counsel, most have been doing it for a year, trying to figure out how they're what their next move will be depending on what the Supreme Court rules. Some of the things to look for is, will they outlaw any race-based scholarships? Will that be seen as, no longer permissible? And that's raising all kinds of questions. I had a VP of enrollment share with me, what about the scholarship that a donor earmarked for Black kids 50 years ago and the donor's not alive anymore? What are we supposed to do with that? These are the kinds of questions that are being asked to general counsels getting ready. So that's one thing to look for. Will all race-based scholarships be no longer legal? Secondly, how will recruiting be impacted? That's something to look for. Will you be allowed to have a fly-in that has a racial component, or a summer bridge program, or an orientation? Or will all that stuff have to be race neutral? Third thing, will there be any use of race at all in the admissions factor? So it's all, in the past, it's been one of many factors that you could use, like gender and socioeconomic status and major and all kinds of different things as you're assessing a student in a holistic review. Will there be any component? So I'm expecting definitely some scaling back and curtailing of things in the past. Will they categorically get rid of everything? We don't know. Ketanji Brown Jackson seems to have been quite influential so far since she's joined the Supreme Court. I'm not saying she's going to persuade the conservative justices, because I don't see that happening. But you might be able to carve out a nuanced role for race. I know some people were surprised that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was not overturned in a decision that came down, a major decision that came down this week. The Roberts Court had all but gutted the Voting Rights Act. And this was the last part that was still standing, Section 2. And most court watchers expected them to completely overturn it. It did end up being a 5-4 decision. And the predictable people, the Alitos and the Thomases, the Gorsuches, of course, I've not really seen them break at all from the conservative stance. Coney Barrett seems to line up pretty much all the time there as well. Roberts has sometimes been the one who sometimes votes with the liberals and progressives. He joined them, and in a surprise move, so did Kavanaugh. So you can get surprises. So it made it a 5-4 decision upholding the Voting Rights Act. This had to do with a gerrymandering situation in Alabama, a state that's close to 30% Black and has 7 main jurisdictional districts, and only one really had Black representation because everybody was being pushed into one district and there was no ability to really have representation, and it was deemed to be unconstitutional. It was so egregious. People didn't see that coming. So there is a possibility for some nuance and a little bit of a surprise. We'll just have to see. But here's the second thing I want to share. Colleges will still remain absolutely committed to finding ways to come up with racial diversity, no matter what the court does. Every fiber in their being believes that hearing from people of all different persuasions, of which race is one, I mentioned a few others. Class is one. Gender is one. Interest is one. Academic interests and others. Culture, religion. Having disparate views brought around a learning laboratory is the best education to train minds and to produce critical thinkers and to produce people who understand people going out into the world. Employers want it. Colleges believe it in their core. There's a resentment that the Supreme Court, who doesn't understand educational institutions like they do, would come in and dictate to them on this matter. So they will, within the law, come up with creative ways to continue to try to find racial diversity. You've seen that in the 10 states that have outlawed race into college admissions. You've seen creative attempts by the Washingtons and the Californias and the Michigans and the Texases, as well as the other 6 states. And so you will see it. There's things that schools can do. They can target counselors that have very diverse populations they work with and fly them in and build relationships with them. Invite them to be on advisory boards, knowing you're getting to the neck and the neck can influence the students to apply to their schools. It's just one of many, 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 many things that will still be attempted. You're going to see a lot of creativity unleashed, but at their core, schools will not give up their attempt to recruit for diversity. You're going to see some class-based things, more of an emphasis on class, which also gets at race. You'll see targeting of zip codes. You're going to see all kinds of things that are racial proxies, to be honest. Nobody will call it that because they'll be afraid of the blowback. But you're going to see recruitment attempts that really are racial proxies because at the end of the day, you can't ask a school to go against its educational mission. So was my answer to Chris, and that's my answer to you. And I'm sure we'll be coming back really soon because this is going to be a very significant decision for college admissions. All right, now let's talk about yield. So first of all, if you're not familiar with that term, yield is just a mathematical formula. It simply looks at the percentage of acceptance students that sign enrollment contracts and commit to come to your school. If your school admits 1,000 kids and 100 come, then you have a 10% yield. 900 come, which no school has a yield. Actually, nobody has a yield even over 80 anymore. But if 800 would come, you'd have a 80% yield. If 200 come, you have a 20% yield, right? So you get it. And in college admissions, yield is, I can't go so far to say everything, but as one astute observer of college admissions said, yield drives the bus. Because at the end of the day, you got to put heads in beds, and you got to try to put the right heads in beds. So it's not about who you accept, it's about who enrolls. And I think if any of our listeners who have no experience with admissions were to all of a sudden be in college admissions, probably one of the things that would surprise you the most is how important yield is, how hard schools work to increase their yield, and just how many things are impacted by yield. Certainly your budget, but also the quality of your student body. So I say all that as a backdrop. I originally was going to go in here and talk about medical school GPAs and how they vary from 25 to 30 different schools. I'm going to come back to that at some point, but probably not anytime soon because there's a lot of other things more pressing to talk about. So what made me decide to talk about this today was something that was said when I was at Vanderbilt. So Vanderbilt, they started out and they did a presentation on highly selective admissions. Something really caught my attention there, and I want to share it with you. And then we're going to go into a lot of the ramifications of what we're referring to. So there's a presentation that we got on selective admissions. It was very, very good. There was some really good transparency in there. And one of the statements that came out was the number one priority for our admission office is to increase our yield. We have set a goal to get to 60% yield, meaning, so Vanderbilt brings in a class of 1,600 in their freshman class. So you would just work it backward, right? You would add 60% onto that, and you would get a number, somewhere around 2,600, a little bit more than 2,600 acceptances that you need to go out with offers to get 1,600. Now, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about where Vanderbilt has been with its yield. So in 2006, it was 38.5. And then from 2013 to 19, it was always in the 40s. It was low 40s, mid 40s. The highest it ever got was 48.6 in 2018. Then in 2020, it dropped to 39.9. So if you really think about it, that's pretty consistent, right? In 2006, it was 38.5. In 2020, 14 years later, it's gone from 38.5 to 39.9. This is when Vanderbilt said this isn't good enough. They reached out and hired somebody from the University of Chicago. Made it clear one of the main tasks with the person they hired was bring our yield up like happened in Chicago. So let's look at the numbers. 2020, it's 39.9. 2021, it goes to 48.3. 2022, it goes to 53.3. And then this year, 2023, it goes to 55%. It was a 3-year plan to get to 60% next year. So I want to cover several things about this. One, I want to talk about why is yield so important? What are the reasons why this would be so important? But before I get into that, I also want to share some other information that Vanderbilt shared, which has to do with the overlap schools, who they overlap with. In other words, you look at your shared applicant pool. Who's your shared applicant pool? Who is it that also applies to Vanderbilt, the schools that they overlap with the most? Well, since 2010, every single year, Vanderbilt's number one overlap has been Duke. Every year, Duke, since 2010. Probably before that, but that's the data that, that I've seen, that I'm aware of. Currently, number 2 overlap is Harvard. And that actually was also the number 2 overlap back in 2010. So it hasn't changed. Okay. Now I'm giving data through 2022. The number 3 overlap right now is Yale. So Duke number 1, Harvard number 2, Yale number 3. And that was number 4 back in 2010. Number 4 overlap is Northwestern. That was number 6 in 2010. 5th biggest overlap, Stanford. That was number 6 in 2010. 6th biggest overlap is Columbia. That was 20th. So Columbia's had a big change. It's gone from 20th all the way to 6th. 7th biggest overlap, Princeton. That was actually 3 back in 2010. And I'm not going to comment on all the schools other than I'll tell you one more that's changed substantially, and that is MIT. MIT was 24th, and now MIT is 14th. Emory is 15th. Emory was 10th. So you'll see a little bit more why I'm bringing that back in, just for context, for you to have it. Okay, so let's talk about why yield is so important. I'm going to go over 5 or 6 reasons with you, and I'll comment on all of them. Some people say that the reason why yield is so important is people want to impress applicants with their high yield. I've heard this a lot. I personally don't believe it. I don't think this is valid. Most of the public doesn't know what yield is. They don't care. They don't understand it. And I hear people say that a lot. Well, They want to increase their yield to impress people. Nobody knows what it is, and most people don't care. So I don't think that's valid. You have heard me say before, and I stand by this, from my experience, the public judges schools 4 ways. I'm not necessarily going to put all of them in order, but maybe someday I will. But what are the 4 ways? Well, one is the reputation of the school in the eyes of those who are important to them. And they usually discern that by throwing out the list of schools they're thinking about, and it gets calibrated based on the reaction. Oh, wow, that's a great school. Oh, my goodness. Silence. And a student creates some type of calibration as to what school seems to be very good versus not good based on the reaction of those who are important. That's a huge way schools get calibrated. People also look at acceptance rates. Second. Third, test scores. Fourth, rankings. Once again, I didn't give those to you in order, but those are the big 4 in my opinion. I can't even think of somebody ever telling me, I'm so impressed with this school. Look at its incredible yield. That makes me want to go there more. So I don't agree with that. Now, I do believe that there is some impressing of peers. And I think that can be important to certain people, because what happens when you're in admissions is you always have get-togethers with others, who are kind of in your peer group, whether it's, like, for example, a lot of the large public school VIPs of enrollment are all in Idaho right now for a big meeting. And I was talking to Fabrizio, who's the UTK VP, who will be interviewed. And I was just talking to him about a lot of the other large VPs of enrollment that we've had on the podcast. And he would be like, oh, yeah, Gary Clark's going to be there. Oh, yeah, Rick Clark's going to be there. Oh, yeah, Lisa Prescott, they're all going to be in Idaho. So there are these gatherings that happen with your peer group, small liberal arts, moderately selective, highly selective, people who have similarities. Sometimes that's done to compare records and learn from each other. That can be important in that group. People do highly, highly value yield in that context. It is seen as a better reflection of your brand strength than acceptance rate or number of applications, both of which are more easily to manipulate. So you can make a case that someone who's, very ambitious and wants to impress peers may be partly influenced by that. However, I think that's a very, very minor factor when it comes to why yield is so important. Okay, let's look at another reason why yield could be important. Reducing your workload. What do I mean by that? Well, you got to get heads in bed. You got to fill up. And so the lower your yield, the more work you're doing to bring in people, not just file reading, but all the courting process to try to get them to enroll. So if you can do that faster and quicker by getting a higher conversion rate, you reduce your workload. So I definitely think that's some factor on some level as to why yield's important. I would not say it's the most important, but it's certainly a factor. Let's look at another reason. Pleasing stakeholders. So what do I mean by this? Well, anybody can fill up your school if you just admit everybody. So stakeholders and people who are watching your school, they're not just simply going to look at, did you fill up, but who did you fill up with? And the higher your yield, the better chance you have of the stakeholders feeling like they got the people that they think the school should be attracting. Now, who are the stakeholders I'm referring to? I'll give you 10. The board, the president, the provost. By the way, the provost is like the chief academic officer over all the faculty in the academic program. The faculty, 4, alumni, 5, coaches, 6. Anybody interested in artistic talent? Could be the orchestra, could be choral music, fundraising, advancement, or development. And then the last 2, parents and students. People are watching like a hawk. Not necessarily at yield percentage, although some of those people are, but to see if you got the people that they think the school should get. In some cases, that might mean the academic profile. Does it look like the students are getting stronger or not? In some cases, somebody might be concerned with some component of compositional diversity. Obviously, coaches want talent, right? And it could go on and on. Development advancement, they want people they can give. So different people will look for different things. But your yield rate allows you to, having a higher yield rate allows you to enroll people to please important stakeholders who are ultimately evaluating you. So that is a very, very important reason why yield is important. You don't want to displease stakeholders because you could find yourself unemployed. So that's definitely a big one. The second one, which is like the other side of the coin, is fulfilling institutional priorities. Now, you could say, well, is that the same as pleasing stakeholders? Kind of, but it's a little different. So let's look at an example. So I'll actually give you one for Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's been around 9.5% international. They say they want to grow that number to 11.5%, 12%. There may not necessarily be a stakeholder watching that. There could be. But that's their own internal goal. You have your own internal priority goals, and you partly judge yourself on whether you're able to meet or fulfill those goals. Another goal could be to close the gender gap in your engineering students in your engineering program. You know, I'm not going to mention which school, but one of the 10 schools we visited, they were going on and on about their engineering program. And one of the counselors said, what's the gender breakdown, you know, in your engineering program? They're particularly talking about chemical engineering. And at first the response was, it's not that good. We really need to do better. And then, you know, a couple other questions came up from other people. And the person came back again. I understand it's not that good, but can you tell me what it is? And it turned out it was less than 10% women. So that's the kind of thing that could be a goal. That's an institutional goal. And so having higher yield allows you to fulfill that institutional goal. No question, that's an important component of yield. But I want to close with another important component of yield. And this has to do with improving your brand, improving your reputation. Now, some of the higher ups at Vanderbilt have made it clear that one of the goals they have is for Duke to not be the number one overlap for Vandy. Well, it's pretty ambitious. It's been the number one overlap is two Southern mid-size research, well-endowed schools for quite some time. Obviously, the goal is not to replace Duke with generic U. It's going back and looking at those overlap schools I said. It's Harvard, Yale. Let me go back and look at the list I told you, 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3 were Duke, Harvard, Yale. So I know what that aspirational goal is. They're trying to, at some point, supplant Duke with Harvard or Yale and make them their biggest overlaps. Now, why would somebody want that? That's all about brand. That's all about brand in the marketplace. Personally, I found it a little comical because I've had conversations with several people at Duke, and Duke wins its overlap battles with Vandy pretty consistently. I mean, every year, not just consistently. Question is, will they win 70% of the time, 75% of the time, 65, high 70s, but they win their overlap battles. So that's very ambitious to try to replace someone who's beating you when it comes to yield and direct competition. But anyway, the point is just to even have that goal indicates part of why you want to increase your yield is to try to improve your stature in the proverbial marketplace. And why would that happen? Well, the higher your yield, the lower you drive down your admit rate. And that's been happening. Looking at Vandy's admit rate, I have the data. So in 2006, it was 33.9. In 2021, it was 7.1. In 2022, it was 6.7. In 2023, it was 6.2. Higher your yield, the less kids you have to admit. Vandy's been consistent the last 3 years. They've had between 46 and 48,000 applicants. Ever since pretty much everybody had that big 30% spike with COVID. And then it stayed up there, and it's stayed consistent around 47,000. So you don't have to get more admits if you can get more to enroll, and then you drive your admit rate down, and then you improve your brand, and then lots of things happen. So I had to ask a question because this was really important to me. When I see who they're overlapping with, quite honestly, their biggest overlaps are bigger brands than they are. They're not going to win the overlaps against Duke, against Harvard, and against Yale. They're just not. So when you tell me that you want to drive your yield up to 60% within 3 years, I want to know how you're planning on doing that. So I raised my hand and asked that question. I said, how are you going to take your yield, which was high 30s, 2020, 39.9, and get it to 60% by 2024? What's the strategy? Because I can think of a few ways you can do it. And I asked that in the question. I said, you could take more kids in ED. I said, you can use more sophisticated methods of predictive modeling. Or you can waitlist more students and put out feelers to see which of these waitlist students will actually come. We refer to this kind of as ED3 because you're not raising your admit rate, but in effect, you're only taking people that are really going to come. So I got some good transparency on that answer. I don't think I got everything. They said they're absolutely not raising their ED rate. They've been at 53. They're going to stay there. But if you knew Vanderbilt a couple years ago, Vanderbilt had a policy of not deferring anybody in early decision. You either got admitted or denied. Now they are deferring, and they were honest enough to say they're intentionally deferring. Now they're only deferring strong, capable people that they think could be additions, but they're very much aware of the fact that when they defer somebody, if they need that person later, there's a better chance that that person will yield because they were willing to commit in the past. So they're being strategic there. They take way more transfer students than most private schools of their stature. They take 220 to 240 transfer kids in. And certainly that's going to be impacting their yield, knowing they're taking those number of transfer students in. And they mentioned other things, legitimate things. They've increased scholarship money to target people and give them a financial incentive or make it more affordable. They've also completely revamped their visit program. Vandy's got a big visit program they call Anchor. 1,000 people, go all out. All the bells and whistles to improve yield. And I'm sure there's some things they're doing that they didn't feel comfortable sharing. So the question is, are all these things legitimate? Well, an institution does have a right to do what's in its own best interest to improve its positioning in the marketplace and not to always factor in, is it in the best interest of students in every single thing that they do? That in and of itself is not wrong, although I know sometimes people think that it is. But I share it for this reason. If you're someone who's applying to Vandy and it's maybe down your list a little bit, there's a good chance it's going to be harder for you to get in because they're locking up spots. Those spots are not going to go to people with either a low probability or less probability of enrolling. It's just something to keep in mind. All right, I got into the weeds on this. It took a little bit more time than I normally would. I don't know if this kind of thing is interesting or boring, so I'd like feedback if you found this to be helpful or not. I just know that we have a pretty sophisticated listenership of both college counselors and parents, and I thought that this might be something that you might find interesting.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
All right, let's transition. There is a brand new interview. It's one that the content is just really, really good. Now, let me say a little bit about this interview before Lisa gets into it. It's a two-parter. It's with Elliot Felix. He's the author of the book. If you are the kind of person who gravitates toward a communication style with a lot of sparkle, a lot of pizzazz, a lot of charisma, that's not what you're going to hear. It's very even keel, and at times it's even dry. But if you can listen attentively, there is so much depth and gravitas and substance. This is an interview that you really want to listen to. So in part one, Elliot talks about his journey from architect to author. He introduces the topic of how to go to college. He talks about where you live, talking about in a context is a big part of how you go to college. He shares the research. He talks about the value of living learning communities. He talks about the new mindset that's required to maximize the value of college. He talks about underutilized resources on a college campus. And he talks about the importance of community. Listen attentively and enjoy. There's a lot here that can help your student to be successful when they actually get to college.
Hi, this is Lisa. I am one of the co-hosts of Your College Bound Kid, and I'm very excited to speak with Elliot Felix today about how students can succeed in college. Elliot's definitely an expert about this. He is an author of the book, How to Get the Most Out of College, 127 Ways to Make Connections, Make It Work for You, and Make a Difference. So, Elliot, it's so great to see you. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Lisa.
So tell us a little bit about your background. How did you come to write this book?
Well, it's funny. I started off as an architect, and I really enjoyed working as an architect for 4 or 5 years. But there was one problem, which is we didn't know enough about the people we were designing for. And that really bugged me. I wanted to understand, not only their hopes and dreams, but their needs. And so I went back to grad school to try and understand people a little bit better so that I could create better places for them. And I was lucky enough to find a great place to work after grad school at MIT, where we would write design briefs to create better buildings. So we would do social science research to understand people, to understand the market, the competitive landscape, the trends, the culture, and we would boil all that down to create a design brief so that an architect knew what problem they were solving. And I did that for a while, and then I realized that all this great research was uncovering things that space alone couldn't solve. That really the thing we were trying to do was improve people's experience, and to do that, space was a really powerful tool, but student services, technology systems, staffing, these were all equally important. And so I started a company called Bright Spot Strategy to do that. And we've been lucky enough to work with more than 100 colleges and universities to help them attract and retain students. And, it's interesting, as I think about my own journey, we know that what happens in the classroom is important. We know that what happens outside of the classroom is important. And if I try and draw the straightest line between an experience I had in college with what I'm doing today, it was actually in student government, because in student government, we got together and we identified some problems. We did a survey, we did interviews, we compared ourselves to other schools, and then we went to the dean and said, we love it here, but it could be better, and these are the things we recommend. And she said, this is great, let's do it. And so we actually got the pay for TAs doubled. We got our thesis projects kind of showcased in a book and an exhibition. We adjusted the schedule so that we could take courses in other departments and really enrich our experience. And that, in a way, is like foreshadowing the kind of consulting work I've been lucky enough to do over the last 20 years with lots of different universities.
Well, that is really fascinating. I love when people have career changes like that, because I think so many students feel like they have to get it right on the first go, or that it's not going to evolve as you evolve as a person. And you're a great example of that. Now, it sounds like you were a pretty active person in college, though. Is that correct? You were in student government, you were making changes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, architecture school is kind of all consuming if you let it. And I think I went through a pretty typical arc where you go in and you work really hard and you stay up all night because everyone else is, and you sort of ignore your other classes because that's what you think you're supposed to do. And then over time you realize how foolish that is, and you realize that your classes outside of architecture, they help you think differently, they help you write, they help you think, they help you communicate, they introduce you to a whole other set of people. And that there are things you can do outside of the classroom and outside the studio, like student government or like a club sport. I was briefly on the trivia team as well, and those are really what enrich your experience. So I was pretty busy, and initially entirely in the discipline, but ultimately getting a broader view of things.
Yeah, I guess I asked that because I think one of the main points that you do make in your book is that a lot of college students make the same big mistake. And I wonder if you could tell us more what that is.
Yeah, and I think I don't fault students or their parents for this, because I think it's part of how we talk about college. We spend a lot of time talking about where to go to college, which is important, but we don't spend enough time talking about how to go to college. And what I've found in my consulting work and with the research, decades of research on what helps students succeed, is that it's the everyday decisions that are really what determine your success, even more than the big decision of where you go, it's how you go. And so I think what students can really do to get the most out of college is think about those everyday decisions, what class to take, what to do a project on in that class, where to live, whether to do an internship, how to get involved, what to get involved in. These are all important choices. And the great thing is students don't have to guess at these, because there really is decades of research on how to do all this. And of course, it's different for every person, but it's a great starting point.
Yeah, I mean, you make such a great point that we don't focus on the how to go to college at all. And that's never a topic. And I think that it's great that you are doing this now. I'm fascinated to hear about these proven strategies that that are proven by research that can help students know what to do. Let's start with, let's say, where they should live. So tell us what the research says about that.
Yeah, where to live is such an interesting question. And there are two fields of research on this that are so pertinent. And of course, who you're living with is very important, and I don't want to discount that. But in terms of the kind of space you're in and how it's organized, that's really important too. And the kind of space, typically you encounter three different kinds of dorms or residence halls based on how the rooms are arranged. They could be along a hallway, which you might think of as more traditional. They could be grouped into suites, maybe 5 or so rooms around doubles, around a common room, or they could be even more apartment style, which used to be typical for upper level students, graduate students, but is actually migrating it down, and lots of first and second years are in apartment style dorms. It turns out that, awkward as it may be, the hall style dorm is way more effective for your first couple years, because kind of forces you to interact with more people. 22% more interaction is what some studies show. And so students in a hall-style dorm, they have greater interaction, and out of that greater interaction, they have a stronger sense of community, and they have more connections. They have a broader, better network. And it's really interesting, and it's particularly useful for some groups. I think they've found, for instance, Black students that are in a hall-style dorm tend to do almost a letter grade higher than those in others. Of course, that's not true for everyone. Everyone's different. But I think if you can be in a residence hall that's going to push you a little bit to open yourself up to new people, new opportunities, it will really pay off. And the second important thing is not so much about the organization of the space, it's about the organization around an idea. And that's what sometimes is called a living learning community. And a living learning community is where you're organizing a residence hall around an idea. It might be around entrepreneurship. It might be around a language. It might be an idea like environmental sustainability. But having that common interest, that common bond, that's also proven to have great impacts on your college life. Students who are in living learning communities tend to be more comfortable taking risks. They also, they're more likely to be comfortable interacting with peers, like on a project, working with other students on a class project. And they also have an enhanced sense of community. So I think as you're thinking about where to live, look really carefully at how the rooms are arranged and think about a residence hall that might be organized around an idea, or even an identity. Could be about race or ethnicity, or an idea.
That is so fascinating. And I can hear your architecture training in the background describing that. You're right. I mean, I think a lot of kids don't want to live in the hall setting because it's different than maybe what they grew up with, and they kind of are, wanting to have their own privacy. But I think it's so easy now for kids not to interact with other kids, and that sort of proximity can really force them to do that. And then the other thing is the living learning community, which I think, there's colleges are doing more and more of those, but you're right. Like if you are interacting around an idea or an interest, you're going to, form stronger connections with people. You're going to spend more time with them. And it seems, it seems like you're saying is like people need to these kids need to practice being around other kids, dealing, being more comfortable, being in close contact with other kids. And that will help them later in life then, in terms of grades, in terms of getting jobs, all of that.
Yeah, I think it's about interactions and it's about ideas. And if you're in a setting that helps you interact more with other people, and if you're in a setting that helps you connect with those people on an idea, like, you all care about the environment, or you all want to create some kind of social impact, or start companies or whatever, it's just it accelerates the reason you're in college in the first place, right? Which is to build skills, build a network, be part of a community, learn about a subject you care about, ultimately get a credential, find a career. This is a way to jumpstart that process.
Wow, that's great. And then you also have a lot of ideas about how students should get involved in different organizations and activities in college. Can you tell us more about that?
So to focus on how to go to college and not just where to go to college, students really need a new kind of mindset. I think a lot of the times people talk about college as something to navigate or get through. And I get that it can feel like an obstacle course or like a maze, you're trying to navigate. But it's the students who take ownership over their experience and think about college as something they create that really take full advantage of everything their institution has to offer. And that shift means that you're not, the navigator, you're the designer and the creator of your own experience. And what I tried to do is put all these tips together in my book so that those are like the building blocks that you create a great college experience out of.
Yeah, I think kids don't they they haven't had the chance maybe in high school to have that sense of control or agency like you do have in college to really design a unique experience that works for you. And so having a book like yours is great because I'm sure most kids have no idea how to do that without a little guidance. So in terms of designing their experience, are there things that you recommend that they do versus not do? Like, how do you advise a kid to do that?
Yeah, so I think the three big ideas of design, at least in my mind, of course, there's different definitions, but it's understanding people, it's making connections, and it's testing things out. And so if you're designing your own experience, you have to start by understanding yourself. And that takes a lifetime, but you can get started. And that might be about understanding your strengths, understanding your interests, understanding your passions, and thinking about ways to pursue those. So when it comes to getting involved, maybe you pick something that has to do with an academic interest so that you can kind of extend what's happening in the class outside of it. Maybe you pick something that has to do with an interest you've already had that you want to continue, and you mix it up, but you try a few things. Don't spread yourself too thin. But I think getting involved in some way is really critical. And by the way, one way to get involved could even be your campus job. I mean, I worked at the dining hall, and I met lots of people that way my first year. So, there's a range of ways to get involved. And I think that second big idea of design, the making connections, that's in play here too, because if you can find opportunities when you're in college to get kind of a 2-for-1, maybe you're in a journalism class and you go to an event and then you write about the event. Right now you're doing something out of class that actually helps you in class. Or maybe there's a project for one class that you could relate somehow to a project for another class, and then you can go deeper. Or maybe you free up time to do something else. I mean, I think one thing I'm very careful to help people understand about my book is it's not a shortcut. I don't think there are shortcuts. I think, it's not about doing as little as possible. I feel like there's plenty of other books out there that, that are sort of like the college equivalent of the 4-hour work week. If I find a way to save students time, I want them to pour it back into their experience, so that they can take full advantage of everything their college and university offers. Because if there's one thing I've learned in consulting for over 100 of them, it's that colleges and universities do so many awesome things that they wish more students took advantage of. They wish more students knew about, they wish more students benefited from.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I love how you talk about it's not a shortcut, but it's a way to have a fuller and more enriching experience. And I do think that, kids seem to have a hard time pushing themselves to take advantage of all the things that the colleges have to offer. I was talking to a friend of mine, she's got a senior in college, and, she was saying that he, was having difficulty finding a job. And I'm like, well, did he go to the Career Center? And she's like, well, what do you mean? And so I was able to log on to my daughter's, she's at a different college, Career Center website. I'm like, well, there's this job, there's this job, there's this job. I'm sure he goes to a fabulous university that they have all of this and more there too. And so I hope that he took our advice and went, but that was just not where his mind was. He was just applying on the internet. So, I mean, I think that, that is something we have to kind of help students break through and really push themselves to do.
Yeah, the Career Center is a great example because it's an underutilized resource that has huge value. And if you think about the ARC, they can help you anywhere along your career journey. You can meet with a career counselor, career advisor in your first semester. You could take an assessment, to start to understand a little bit about yourself. You could chat with them about potential career paths. They can help you reach out to maybe some folks that could be role models. I think one of the best things to do early on is talk to people and even shadow people for a day, for an hour, that have a job you think you might want. And then you can work backwards from that. You can understand a little bit about their career path. And a career center can help you do that. They can help you do a mock interview. They can help you with your LinkedIn profile. They can get you connected on Handshake, which is the platform that most colleges use to post job opportunities or internship opportunities. So they can help you at every step of the way. But not enough students take advantage of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I hope that, that if students and parents are listening out there, like, use these resources. You have some other resources that you recommend that I think might be underutilized too. And that's sort of writing centers, academic advising, and even mental health counseling or other kinds of counseling that schools offer.
Absolutely. I think one way of thinking about this is understanding how the campus library has changed in the last 20 years, sort of since the birth of or at least the rise of the internet. And I think we used to think about libraries as a place for books, and they still are, but now there's so much more. And on most campuses, the library is really this hub of services to support students as they do projects. And I think students are certainly taking exams, studying for tests, writing papers, but they're also doing projects alone or in a team. And maybe it's a marketing class and you're creating a marketing plan or a social media strategy for a local nonprofit, for instance, what might be called an experiential learning project. To do that, you can do, just like the Career Center can help you any step of the way, there are services and centers on a campus, often within the library, that can help you any step of the way. So for that marketing plan, there's probably a statistics lab or a data lab where you can, after consulting with a librarian to get market data, you can work with someone on how to analyze it, how to visualize it. There is probably a writing center where someone can help you figure out what your main topic is, what the right tone or style is, how to organize your ideas. I mean, it's not an editing or a proofreading service, but it's definitely a writing coaching service so you can get your idea across. There's usually like a communication or presentation center where you can work with someone to figure out how to tell the story of this marketing plan, how to put the PowerPoint, how to put the slides together. Maybe you're going to build a website instead of doing slides. And you can even get your presentation videotaped and then get critique on, oh, this was the strongest part. You opened a little bit soft. I would emphasize this. That transition wasn't so great. Why don't you put this idea first? And if it's not a marketing plan, if you're proposing something, there's usually a makerspace where you could actually 3D print a prototype, or you could create a prototype of your idea. So I think as students are working on projects, which is ultimately a great thing because you're much more likely to get hired when you show someone a project you've done. You're more likely to get hired for your project than your GPA, right? Or your grade on a test. No one's saying like, hey, you should hire me because I aced this test. They're saying, hey, here's this project that's a lot like what I'm going to be doing when I come work for you, and let me walk you through it. And there are so many resources to help you on those projects.
You make me want to go back to college again because I want to go get all of that help and do all of those things. Yeah, you're right. There is so much academic support at schools that I think kids somehow don't always access or don't even know it's there. I know at my daughter's college, she has her own dedicated research librarian. And, I don't know if she's ever used that research librarian. As someone with a PhD, I would have wanted to use a research librarian if I had one. But, that's just one of the many things that they have there, that I don't think a lot of kids are using. Tell me about ways that kids can really successfully build community while they're at college, something that will help them succeed during college and also beyond.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the academics and the academic support are a critical part of college. But the foundation is really about community and belonging. And that's kind of the lens that students look at college through, right? So if they feel like they're part of something, if they feel like they belong, if they feel like they matter, if they feel like they're supported and cared for, then everything else gets better. And if they don't, everything else gets worse, or at least gets harder. And so that community comes in different forms. Part of it can be found, in your residence hall, in your dorm. Part of it could be found in your in a student organization. Could be student government, could be a club, could be around a sport, could be around an interest. Part of it comes through your studies, through your major. Maybe you're hanging out with the other marketing majors or the other journalism majors or whatever they might be. Part of it comes from space. Finding, oftentimes there are spaces associated with different communities. So it might be a community around, it might be the multicultural center. It might be a first gen center. It might be the student veterans center. So it could be a space associated with an identity that a student has. That's a great way to jumpstart finding your people, finding your place. So there's lots of different ways to go about it, and you probably want to mix it up. Maybe something is academic, something is identity-based, something is interest-based, and something could be based on where you live or your campus job. But I think that involvement is so important because nationally, about 20% of students don't make it from their first to their second year. National retention rate's about 80%. And one thing we know is that students who feel a sense of belonging are about 40% more likely to continue into their second year. So it's even worth backing off the academics a little bit if that belonging isn't there, and that involvement is a way to get it.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point.
Friends, this completes the first half. I hope you'll join us next week for the final part. On Thursday's episode, Julia is my co-partner, and we're looking at an article by Scott Jasek that appeared in Inside Higher Ed on May 15th, entitled Admission Offices Cautiously Start Using AI. Our question from a listener, once again, is Laura from Washington, and she wants to get a better understanding of how to know who's actually getting admitted in early Decision 1 when you take out athletes and other protected classes. Our interview will continue, Lisa's interview with Dr. Lewis Newman, looking at his book about the importance of thinking critically and developing those critical thinking skills in college. And Lisa and I will start a whole new college spotlight about our visit to High Point University that we had on May 3rd. Friends, I'm going to close you with a different ending today. One of the VPs of enrollment, and I wish I could remember what school so I could give attribution, but he was talking with us about his message he has for every student, because he finds if they will just understand this message, they'll be so much more successful in college. He says he leaves every student with these 4 words. Don't wait to care. Don't wait to care. If you wait to care, it might be too late. So I close you with that today, friends. Don't wait to care. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.